Good morning, good evening, good day. Greetings with a helping side of salutations. And what is that? Oh, dessert. Welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and thank you for joining us on today's journey. And on said journey, we are greeted, we are welcomed by, and we just say hi to our regular Russ. How's it going?
Hey, how you doing today, Tristan? Happy Monday.
Yes, happy Monday indeed. And happy Monday to everyone out there who's joining us for our little, uh, I would say jaunt. Let's use that word. I'll go to the other word of the dictionary today. And if this is your first jaunt with us, let me introduce ourselves for the first time. So my name is Tristan Watty. I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And I'm joined by
Russ, I am from the Security Incident Response Team, where we help customers contain, mitigate, and overall handle their incidents. So, yeah. Coming to me, it's usually a bad day.
Yeah, but he turns that frown upside down, just like producer Jeff does. Happy Monday, producer Jeff. As always, thank you, producer Jeff, and thank you. If you want to let us know where you're tuning in from, where you're dialing in from, or where you just want to communicate from, let us know.
Or you can put some exact geo coordinates, whatever.
Yeah, right? Security, right? Those little things. So, with that being said, we always have to have two questions. And today's second question is going to be, would you rather have unlimited coffee for life, but it's always lukewarm, or unlimited free snacks, but you can only eat them between 2 and 3 p.m., like a proper snack? Russ, where are you going?
This is an easy one for me. There's not a chance in hell you'll ever catch me drinking lukewarm coffee, for sure. So I will definitely be going with snacks. And also, it's the perfect time, 2 to 3 p.m., every day except for Monday. 2 to 3 p.m. is usually when I'm starting to get a little, laggy in the afternoon. So that's the perfect time for a pick-me-up snack.
So it's interesting because my brain goes to, can I take away the snacks between 2 and 3? Or can I just heat up the coffee, even if it's lukewarm? And Deadlock, thank you for joining it. Unlimited snacks. Yes.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people tend to go snack wise, that approach. Producer Jeff goes with, let's see, what is that? Coffee.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say pretty much. You get like 2 sips of hot coffee before it becomes lukewarm because you're doing other work. So there's that piece. But I like to continue this conversation. But something that's not lukewarm, that's piping hot, are your logs when they're centralized. See, every week I get a little bit worse. But what we try to do here is have some fun with it. So just like we have fun with our centralized logging structure, right? Because it's such a great topic to speak about. But before we get into that, Russ, where did we come from last week, and where are we going this week?
Last week, our topic of the week was My Key Academia, training to unlock AWS KMS. But you don't need to have watched last week's episode to follow along with this week's episode. We try to keep them as modular as possible. Not to say that you shouldn't go back and look at some of our older episodes. But today's topic will be Go Beyond plus logging. Centralized logging for incident response.
Yes, you can see the enthusiasm in Russ's face.
I was trying to do the
yeah, see?
Plus ultra.
If you get that reference, 10 billion points to you, because what we're trying to do is drive that enthusiasm about logging, right? How do you turn, all of the logging coming from one source into a centralized location, almost like you're doing one for all, right? So what you're trying to do with this is assemble your log squad in a way that is efficient for your environment. Because what we usually have the conversations about is, yes, how smooth it was, but also how and what logs do we care about when it comes to incident response? And that's usually a question that we have a lot of customers ask us of like, do I need these logs? Do I need VPC flow logs? Do I need DNS resolver queries? These are all questions. So when you look at your vault, your centralized log archive account, if you're using a control tower setup, okay, what do you put in there? What do you need to have? And the other piece of this is, do we know the difference between picking, let's say, organizational trails versus account trails? They always say choose your hero suit wisely, but I think that also applies to logging as well. Because what we're trying to get down to is, if something were to happen, do we understand the chain of events? If something were to happen in terms of a key compromise, do we know the chain of custody? How do we preserve evidence? How do we implement hero-grade controls within our environment? And I think the good pause to take here is to take a second and say, hey, what question do we ask ourselves when we're first starting? Well, I think we got one right here. So, Russ, where are you going with this? Which AWS log source is your MVP for incident response?
Okay, so this one is initially very tough, but if we're talking about the MVP, it's got to be CloudTrail. That's, my first stop to get more pivot points or, more evidence. I'm going to first start with CloudTrail. So that's going to be my MVP. But it was really hard if you're just thinking about like what are important logs. I mean, all of these are for sure. And even AWS config history, that one was a little bit of a curveball because I was almost going to say that, because that can be also extremely valuable, especially when we're talking about incident response. So it was kind of a tough one, but I got to go with CloudTrail.
And I think that's like almost like the bread and butter, if we were to use analogies, right? Exactly. Where's your go-to for a lot of things, even if you didn't have anything set up. Usually you go like, oh, the API call came from where? And you do CloudTrail. But one of the things I would say is I usually like guard duty findings. Why do I like guard duty findings? It's another method of, let's say, figuring out the larger scale puzzle within your environment, right? It's that historical event registry. And it also allows a lot of automation, which I like, because you can trigger Lambda functions with it. You can do a CloudTrail, yes. But guard duty, something happened within your environment. It's triggering that specific alarm, which you can trigger a whole bunch of items like automated remediation playbooks. But I digress on that. Feel free to put in the chat 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5 for whichever one you think. But I think if you take that second to think about, okay, we have all these separate services. We have all these pieces of logs that we have to capture within our environment. And we're trying to figure out how we turn that one source into a centralized source with everything, with all, right? One for all. I'm just going to keep doing it until somebody gets it. But I think part of the conversation needs to be, hey, how do I combine everything to make it that ultimate centralized logging location? You said you like CloudTrail, Russ. What are some of the key aspects of CloudTrail that you're looking for when you're doing it at incident response?
Yeah, so CloudTrail, captures all of the management events, and so it captures every single API call, and so it really does give you that first step to be able to say, hey, this was an access key. What did they do? What services logs do we have to look into? We go into CloudTrail and we see, hey, there was a create user. Oh no, okay, there's the obfuscation or possible persistence mechanism, or hey, there were some weird calls or attempts at a key pair for this now we have to go through S3 buckets. So it's really like my one-stop shop, or my first call when I start an incident. Okay, let me find out what happened. So I'm immediately going to go into management logs, because that's where you're going to have I'd say the most overview-ish type of log trail, which really kind of gives you that the ability to a little bit more quickly see at a high level what happens, so that way you can dig further into individual logs. So that's why I say that. That's why I think it's important.
Yeah, and you raise a couple of great points with that, right? Because essentially we're trying to boil down to who did what, when, and where. When an API call is made, it usually sends out some type of flag that says, I am here. But I digress on that. I'm going to keep doing it all the time, Russ.
I know.
But you also raise it as the CloudTrail management and the data events, right? These are some of the key aspects. And one of the things that we also like to say is hello to Ari and hello to Victor, right? So the next piece, which I think gets overlooked a bit, is the VPC flow logs. And why I say it gets overlooked a bit is because these are the network layer, right, items. Something is accepted, rejected in terms of connections. What's the source destination IPs, the lateral movement. And what we often see is usually customers tend to lean towards, oh, we have this firewall in place that captures these different pieces of the puzzle. But when it comes to VPCs, what you're trying to look for is where are the gaps within my visibility? Do you understand the east and west traffic between your workloads that, let's say, application logs, they can't see or they can't expose the lateral movement, right? I think that's a key part to understand with VPC flow logs is having the ability to see east and west, especially from a VPC, especially when you have these different workloads and you have specific workloads, maybe that's more sensitive than the other workloads. What I mean by that is you think of your PHI, you think your PII, your PCI, all those kind of sensitive data classification types, right? Now, when you're looking to centralize this is just another factor you have to come into understanding within your environment. Because the other piece of this is you may not have to capture all the VPC flow logs. You just capture a subset, maybe your prod logs, for example. You don't necessarily capture those dev logs because of what you're doing for your environment. You have the other mechanisms to compensate for it. And that leads to, okay, I have the network logs, I have some of the management logs, but resolver queries, DNS, everybody's favorite topic, right? I need to get pillows behind me that says DNS approved, right?
Yeah.
Because with DNS,
it was
yeah, let's just get DNS, right? One will have IP and one will have a name, and then somebody will put it together. But what is your data exfiltration? What are the malicious domain lookups, right? Are items being sent to somewhere they're not supposed to be sent to because they are the mask of your domain or your user or something along those lines? So DNS is often the first signal of compromise, right? There's malware beacons that go to certain domains and network connections are established. And usually DNS detects some of these items ahead of time. If you look really closely into the logs and it resolves, right? So when you're trying to be proactive instead of reactive within your threat hunting, that's where you start to look at, hey, what do we have for DNS logs? And setting those up ahead of time. Because Russ, how does DNS help you in your day-to-day?
So it is extremely helpful for DNS logs, not just because it's an extremely important source of logs and what happened. It's usually the one that I'm going to lean, especially when we're talking about a compromise that revolves around that. That's probably going to be my number one stop for my lessons learned or my after action report. Is going to be how did they initially, everyone wants to know the initial access. And DNS is usually going to either provide that or it's going to be the initial discovery, like Tristan said. You're usually going to discover it through DNS. So that's going to be like not only the place you go to look for it, but it also has a lot of other really helpful information. So if you're looking at, say, like a DDoS, for example. DNS is going to help you determine, hey, is this actually a distributed denial of service? Or, hey, this has a good network signature. I'm going to add it to my WAF logs. And so there's a lot of things that DNS, is important for. So it's kind of just all of it kind of coming together.
Yeah. And I think that leads smoothly into kind of where I was leaning towards earlier with guard duty findings, right? Because guard duty findings now, they're essentially that you see CloudTrail logs, VPC logs, DNS logs, they're all kind of sifted through, for lack of better words, in order to get an idea of what's happening within the environment to enable that continuous threat detection, right? So if we take that step back to understand, hey, we have all these different events coming within our environment. How can we kind of score certain findings so that we understand that, hey, this event is out of the ordinary, but this is low opposed to this critical where there might be potential Bitcoin or something along that operation happening. That's it. That's an important consideration. So you can see how we're starting to go down the path of one for all into our centralized location for logging, right? So this is where we take the second to say, Victor, 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 during logging the execution for DNS. That is definitely a thing when it comes to what is happening within your environment. To Russ's point, DNS is usually the first sign of, hey, there's something going on within the environment, right? And continuing on that theme, if you're trying to centralize items, if we go to the AWS native approach, Security Hub should pop into your mind as well, right? It centralizes aggregation of all the findings within the environment. Now, if we take that other pool of items, the guard duty, inspector, Macy, so on and so forth, that's where Security Hub starts to come into play. But where we're trying to stay is within just the general logging, because that's the important part. But the other side of this is, what do your workload logs look like? Right? These provide the specific business context that an AWS native service really can't dive into without some customization and things of that nature, because it's your custom workload within your application that could be sitting on an EC2 instance somewhere, right? So those are the pieces of the puzzle that capture maybe authentication events or business logic flow that may be unique to your environment. That, hey, this is not normal in my environment for somebody to take this path, for example. And it's that last mile when it comes to what the attack story was, right? I think that's the way to look at it. So now that we have our logs centralized, Russ, kind of, how do we look at it? How do we look at kind of increasing our security posture with that?
Yes, exactly. Because once we have a centralized repository, that's going to be an extremely high attack value, or have extremely high attack value, because that's where all of your logging exists. Especially if there's a threat actor or attacker or whatever who's trying to obfuscate what they're doing, logging is going to be an extremely easy way to do that. So there's a bunch of things that we're going to have to do because, as this is our, hero headquarters, we're going to have to protect it. It's going to be highly critical. And so when you're looking at that, how do we do that? How do we set up this, secure environment so that way we can all, have a headquarters where all of our tooling and stuff like that will pull from. So some of the ways that we're going to do that, account isolation. So having a separate account just for logging or just for security tooling. That way, not only are you, protecting yourself in case, one of your production accounts or even a development account, one of your accounts gets compromised, your logging doesn't necessarily, because it's isolated. It's not part of the organization. It's not part of anything. It's its own separate, almost like break glass type of account. So that way, no one really has access to it unless they absolutely need to. And it would also behoove, if we're going to isolate the account, to also have least privilege access. That way, either most people don't have access to it because they just don't need to. Your security engineers only have, access to what they need. So, for example, just logs from certain locations based on the incident responder. It could be a million different things depending on, your actual context of your account and stuff like that. So applying SCPs or IAM boundaries, you can also even least privilege down to the fact that maybe no human users will have access to it, and only tooling or automated log delivery could have access. So there's different things that you can do as far as access and isolation. But in order to also prevent things like attackers accessing and then being able to obfuscate what they're doing or change and make things, harder to investigate or harder to prove in court if that's, something that you're looking to do. So there's different things that we can do for, resisting tampering. So, one thing is using S3 bucket policies, or ensuring that, an object is locked, using object locks. That way, it can't be changed unless there's certain permissions, or I know that there are some ones that prevent you from being able to make any changes unless you have MFA authenticated. So there's different tamper-resistant actions you can take to, prevent evidence destruction, or obfuscation from a threat actor, whatever it might be. So that's going to be another important method to, locking down our account. Also, got to take into consideration, since it is an isolated account, the cross-account aggregation. So how you're centralizing CloudTrail, how are you pulling in those logs from those, production and dev accounts and sending it to your logging account? Config, VPC, flow logs, all of the things, guard duty findings, everything that, we're looking to centralize here. How do we get that, and how do we centralize that from all of our accounts in our organization to our logging account? And, ensuring that we're doing that in a way that, doesn't allow for tampering or anything like that with our logs. And then also, in order to prevent, basically a security engineer from, especially when we're considering like an insider threat situation, how do we ensure that the same person isn't the one person that accesses this thing every time? How do we ensure that there is some sort of separation of responsibilities, so that way, those are the ones that are generating logs aren't the ones that are deleting those logs. Ensuring that, we are keeping these logs, in a safe location and ensuring their integrity. We want to be able to prove, especially if we're, referencing forensics and ensuring the credibility in a court of law. All of that is going to be extremely important, when we're talking about preserving evidence. So a lot of that is going to be, your way of doing that is isolating the account, ensuring permissions are really locked down, ensuring that these are properly being accessed across your accounts in your organization, and then, preventing tampering, which will also help preserve, the integrity of our evidence. So kind of lots of things, but it's important that we do it because it is the headquarters, it's the base of everything.
Yeah. And I would take the second to point out, Victor says minor or CT for impact, I'm assuming. And I think that's an important part to think about too, is kind of when you're looking at all of your log sources, are you going through a tabletop exercise? Are you going through just understanding where the potential gaps are within my environment? To Russ's point, do we have separation of duties? Do we have the different mechanisms to say, hey, this person with his glasses off is not the same person as his glasses on, especially when you're dealing with PCI and HIPAA and things of that nature, right? because there are mechanisms that you have to put into place. And one of those mechanisms is, what is my centralized logging account? What goes into that account? And from where, after it gets centralized, does it go? Because that's usually the second part of that, right? It's like, okay, I got everything to my logging archive account. Now what? And usually that would flow into some type of auto remediation, some SIM, and then you go from there. But I think to understand where you go, you kind of have to think of it in a certain way. And that way is, what came before and what shall not come after. I think it works. So, as SideQuest Legend has it, right, is our segment where we dive into a customer story, where we kind of go down this road of, I would say, what if a little bit, but also just learning from experiences. So, if we cue some good old SideQuest music, we shall bring up the SideQuest board, which is the physical representation of our customer story. So, today's journey, we should speak about the lore of Log Sentinel, which is, let's just say, a company that thinks that they have mastered their centralized logging, right? They understand instant response. They're a leading cloud security piece, right? But after migrating their telemetry, they start to have some patterns form, some certain references, some certain, hey, what is this as we're growing that we're not scaling properly with? So, Russ, the first question I pose to you is, if I think my logs are secure because I have centralized logging, what else am I missing? What gaps do I have?
I mean, the gaps we're looking at, I guess I don't really have enough information about this company yet.
Yeah, so that's why I dive back in to give you some more information. So he rolls the dice and says, we need to find out more. Well, if we think about this company that's built up their logging flow, let's say they're enterprise and they have 4.7 petabytes, right? That's a good round number of different pieces of information that they need to get through on a daily, let's say, basis. They have everything centralized. They have some SCPs to prevent disabling of CloudTrail and guard duty because they looked at Control Tower, but now you're starting to get to a place where something happened within their environment. And their attack surface was understood by somebody that wasn't them. And as Ari says, they roll for perception. Right? And Victor, I'm a world recorder for logging. Right? So we have a role perception and a world recorder. So we will march on. But one of the things that they missed out on is chain of custody. They didn't have S3 object locks on their log archive buckets. They didn't have log file, let's say, validation within CloudTrail. And they had account level trails instead of organizational trails. These are some of the pieces of the puzzle. So, in your customer stories that you have dealt with, how have you dealt with it? Let's see what I did there.
So as far as centralized logging goes, I've usually, if you are setting up a centralized logging repository, hopefully you're going to do at least the minimum, put in some of those, account isolation and your permissions. And like you said, looking at account versus org trails. For the most part, it's usually an issue with whether they have the logging or not. So they might have centralized logging, but what is being put into those repositories? That's usually the logging issue I have. A lot less so when there is a centralized logging repository, and there's actual this effort is usually put in once someone decides that it is centralized logging is necessary. So I'd actually say that this is a pretty uncommon occurrence for me and IR.
Yes. And that's the thing is something always veers off the beaten path of, hey, this was supposed to be set up like this, and then we have something happen. So in our environment, we have our CloudTrail logs, for instance, go into our centralized log archiving bucket. Now we also have some users that aren't authenticated also accessing said bucket or said environment by having access into the AWS environment. How do I understand and protect against this, Russ?
So understanding not just your setup, but also what those when we're talking about the account isolation and permissions and stuff, that's just having good permissions and having your IAM scoped out properly. Isolating the account is something that basically you would hopefully have a good idea of doing, especially when you're considering the difference between isolation and quarantining. But the principles are pretty similar, and so just kind of it still goes back to defense in depth. If your permissions are bad in IAM in general, this is also going to be a problem. But if you have good hygiene with your permissions and your SCPs, you're more likely to implement that as well into this kind of environment for the repository. So kind of thinking of it as just another very critical information that you have to set up and design. So yeah,
and with said IAM, that pushes back our unauthenticated users a little bit, right? Because we have now the proper identity, whether it be SCP or permission boundary or something along those lines, and then we have a mechanism to alert within our AWS environment to findings of said users trying to access things that they're not supposed to do. So to our point, we are continuing on our journey. And where is our journey going? Well, to something a little bit off in the yonder. And that is Security Hub. Now, Security Hub, Russ, what do we do with it?
Oh, you just leave that alone. No, Security Hub, as the name implies, is supposed to be a hub for all things security. So we're not just talking about, this is where detection and defense occur. No, this is compliance, regulatory, also the detection piece and vulnerability management. It is the hub for all things. So if you're looking to secure your repo, not just saying, hey, do we have logs and are they encrypted? Going a step further, like, hey, has anyone, tampered with these logs? Do we have anything in Security Hub that shows, something was accessed when it wasn't supposed to be? Or, how do we look at these, preventative actions and see if they're working? So I'd say like a lot of things for Security Hub.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly that. And I think part of this equation is we're starting to build out our environment a little bit. And you start to see how things start to centralize in certain areas. Where if we have guard duty, that's one of the key areas that we were just speaking about. Where, hey, we have Security Hub as well. Hey, CloudTrail, we also have going to Security Hub. But if I were to take an arrow, I would point towards we're still getting these logs generated to a centralized location as well. So you can parse through those logs. You can use a Athena and Glue query in order to kind of say, hey, I'm doing incident response. I need to do an ad hoc query. That's one of the methods I could do so. But as Victor needs to be a non-human user otherwise. I think that's an interesting point, right? Because how much of this has to be human versus non-human interactions, automation, or maybe you can have the AI agent help out with certain pieces of this because you're going to start to grow out your environment. You're also going to have auto remediation items, right? So maybe some of this initial triaging can be done by an agent. And that's where I take my good old Zach Morris timeout and pause to say, hey, let's dive into the next step of this. Let's think about this. Because what we're trying to stay away from is the, sad music playing.
We want to visit Russ music.
Yes. Right? We want to get to a point where everybody's applauding and cheering because, hey, we're on our way. So, how do we get on our way? Well, we take a step back or forward, depending on how you look at it, and then dive into the next story. What story is that, Russ? What are we diving into?
Oh, we're going to talk about organization trails versus account trails. You brought it up earlier, and I was like, oh, I can't wait to talk about this. So let's dig in.
It's an interesting piece, right? So one of those pieces is, hey, a research agent. yeah, that's one way to put it, right? But if you have organizational trails and you have, let's say, accounts of the multiple variety, you may say, okay, I'll just set up everything in my account trails, right? That's how that works. No, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Because organizational trails, they automatically capture every current and future account into your AWS organization so that everything is consistent. And when I say consistent, that means configuration drift. What we're trying to stay away from. New accounts are automatically enrolled at creation, and it eliminates that window of unlogged activities, right? It's almost like handing off the keys to somebody else when they're joining an apartment complex or something along those lines, right? You want to make sure all this interaction is logged somehow, right? Because you're already in the building, you're just handing over the keys. So that's how you think of organizational trails. Account trails, they're useful for isolated situation. Have you used those before, Russ?
Yes, I've seen them, especially for when we're talking about break glass accounts, especially when we're talking about incident response. Break glass accounts are pretty standard, so that's something that I see pretty regularly as far as the design of those.
Yes, and it's fun to have isolations. They shouldn't give me access to this, so we go like this and we go like this. If you get dizzy as a viewer, we're trying things. We're growing, right? That's
I wasn't gonna say it, but yeah, we like to play with new things.
Yeah, you give me a hotkey, and I carry on. I was going to say something, but then I thought about it, and I was like, "Hey, we can save that for another episode. That could be a whole deep dive." But I digress because what we're trying to understand is coverage gaps, essentially,
yes.
Right? So whether something is misconfigured or it is missing trails, right, that we need to investigate because we don't want any dead zones when it comes to attackers that can potentially exploit something within the environment. So if we were to think of, all right, we have our organizational trails, we have our account level trails, which are useful for those isolated standalone accounts, but they usually are prone to, let's say, inconsistencies because they're not centralized. Now, the other piece of this is configuration drift. And that's where you start to think about, how am I getting notified of configuration drift, right? So if you look at AWS config, that's one way, right? Because you can have rules that alert to any attempt to create, let's say, competing account level trails or something along those lines within your individual accounts, within your AWS organization, or just in your environment in general. Because I've seen AWS organizations where, yeah, these accounts are part of our organization, but these are legacy accounts that we kind of acquire that nobody really knows what's going on in those, right? And that creates those blind spots. But I think when you think of blind spots, sometimes it takes an interesting move to take that step back to say, hey, what is the most overlooked item? I think that's a question we could pose to chat. What is the most overlooked log source in your cloud environment? Russ, what do you think it is?
So when we're talking about overlooked, I'm probably going to say The ones that, well, so S3 and DNS query logs are the ones that, are most needed. But when we're talking about overlooked, I'm going to have to go with KMS key usage. That's one that is not checked regularly, but has a ton of information, that's very beneficial to IR. So I think that's going to be the overlooked one, or most overlooked one.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. I tend to go towards DNS query logs, but also I would say east-west network traffic specific to AWS environment, right? And the reason why I say that is usually when customers are first learning and diving into AWS, they think of everything kind of like the on-prem way, right? Where it's just like, I control this, everything goes out the firewall, so I don't really think about these pieces. But when you move to AWS and have VPCs and you have all these accounts and you have all these different items, is what does the east-west network traffic look like? And that's usually a long conversational piece that kind of gets overlooked sometimes, right? Depending on how fast they're trying to accelerate. Because have you seen, Russ, where you have a customer that may say, oh, I have everything controlled where I'm sending all my traffic back on premises, and it doesn't go out to the external internet, right, from AWS.
Yes.
Have you come across that use case?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially if you're not setting up, properly, or using some sort of tunneling, or definitely.
Yeah, and that's usually the case where it's just like, oh, if I have my on-premise environment, everything should be going through there. But like we mentioned, DNS, and do you have VPC pairing? Do you have all these things set up, right? Because essentially where we're trying to get to is that understanding of if something happens, one, what is the method to, I guess, move forward within your environment? How do you preserve the evidence? Because it happened. The item took place. Now, Russ, in your experience, preserving evidence, what have you seen when it comes to that?
Okay, well, I mean, I've seen a lot. I've seen it not be done at all. I've seen it, not be done properly, so it wasn't able to be used in court, or, especially when you have reporting requirements and stuff like that. So, it definitely depends 100% on your own organization and your own architecture, your own, industry responsibilities, and all of those things. But from, a larger perspective, you just have to, at least run some of the basics for forensics. So a couple things that you'd have to do in order to, basically ensure that, your telemetry, or anything, that you're going to use as evidence in your forensics investigation, you need to ensure that your logs, are being validated, that they are of a high integrity. So, enabling, say in CloudTrail, enabling cryptographic hashing, to be able to show that, look, these haven't been altered since we received them, because the hash still is the same. And so doing things like, actually, I referenced it earlier, the MFA delete. So on not allowing, or requiring, I guess would be a better way of saying, requiring MFA in order to make any deletion request for like S3 buckets, so that way, in case someone does get credentials or an access key, it doesn't actually necessarily mean that data will be exfiltrated, because they can't just have a login or IAM user or whatever. You also need to have the MFA authentication. Hopefully, your MFA is set up so that way it's very difficult for someone else to get it. But it's usually a sign of authorized use. And so through MFA. So it's just another piece of the puzzle. We also want to do things like S3 object lock. So that way, you can put it in the mode to ensure that log objects are immutable. So that way, for I think there's like you can define the retention period on that. So say like, okay, I need 90 days of immutable logs or object, excuse me, especially for like preserving forensic evidence or whatever. And then we also have things like KMS encryption. So that way you can encrypt logs at rest with your managed key, your customer managed keys, and key policies, which will allow you to ensure that only the authorized investigators, especially if you have a third party DFIR, with the digital forensics consultant or third party organization, you have to tightly scope those KMS keys, so that way, or those KMS policies rather, so that way only the people who are supposed to have that telemetry are able to decrypt it. So using things like that, retention policies in general are also usually, that's more of a regulatory or possibly legal hold, especially when you're getting in the middle of discovery, which is a whole other process. But for the most part, just making sure that those timelines are set, and so that way you're not destroying evidence before you need it.
Don't delete anything.
Yeah. In general, it's best to not do that. That's actually why when we are in an IR event, we advise customers that not to necessarily terminate, just stop, so that way you can preserve the forensic evidence. And so there's a lot of different ways to ensure that we are properly ensuring that our evidence will be not just proven to be of high integrity, but also can be used if we need it in court. There's a lot of forensic chain of custody, and so you really do need to have that logging enabled to be able to determine, hey, here's the hash. We know it hasn't been changed. We have object locks, so the last 90 days, nothing has been changed in our S3 buckets. Everything's encrypted. Like, you have the evidence to show that your evidence is good. So it's evidence for your evidence, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's important, right? Because you mentioned like S3 locks, right? With Worm, where you have write once and read many, right? Those kind of concepts you need to be familiar with within your environment, because, like Russ said, is, hey, if we're doing incident response, we want to make sure it's like, hey, we want to bring up the environment, but at the same time, we want to preserve what is happening within the environment or what happened to it. Because I've seen stories where it's, hey, you went through this incident response, you deleted everything. Now we can't see the initial, what happened within the environment, because your logs and all these other items that were supposed to be there are not there anymore, right? Because you were trying to bring up the environment. So it just makes the job harder. Have you seen that before?
Yes, absolutely. So that's actually a reason why, forensics, the first step in forensics is to take an image, because as soon as you do something in that, EC2 instance or, in that bucket, you've changed it just by looking and making changes in that account. So if you're not taking an image, you don't have the evidence, the integrity of that evidence. So that's why, we say don't make any changes. Just take a snapshot, take an image, and then you can investigate through that instead of having to, make changes and messing with your own evidence. So
don't change forever. Don't change forever.
Yeah, it's the same principle. So
yeah, and I think when we're along those same lines of don't change forever, you start to get a little bit of that anxiety. Speeding up, things are starting to happen, right? So
boss music.
Where do I go with this, right? Because now I have all these things I have to think about. we spoke about so many ways that we have to monitor and kind of centralize our logs. But one of the key aspects that we also want to look at is, do we understand the basics? Do we understand that certificate knowledge, which we like to bring up every episode, but also that knowledge quest knowledge, right? Uh, Name, pending, working, title. But knowledge quest knowledge is essentially where you think about, hey, what are little deep dives I could go on by myself to read about, to learn about, so that I can kind of build some aura around myself and be that expert when it comes to log management, to say, hey, we need to include VPC flow logs, Route 53 resolver queries, and everything else in between, and I can optimize it. Because that's what we're trying to go to, right? Is how do we optimize for our own environment? Because if you recall last week's episode, we said every environment is quirky from the aspect of they're unique. You can follow the fundamental principles. You can follow the guidelines, the reference architectures, but you customize the environment based on your business outcomes, your business needs, and your business goals. So, with that being said, if you want to build the aura of the security variety, I think if you're trying to understand, hey, how my environment is quirky, you kind of have to dive into it. And the best way to dive into that is become a Quirk apprentice. And what is that said, Quirk apprentice? It's diving into what is CloudTrail and what is config, but how do we do this in style, Russ? How do we figure out which way we're supposed to go with things? Is it starting from scratch or diving into our architecture?
Oh yeah, definitely. I very rarely recommend starting from scratch. So definitely, we have so much documentation, and like Tristan was saying, these things can be so customized to your environment. If you want to find out everything, you got to go to the documentation, because there's just too many, this, that, the other thing. You start getting algebra in there, the letters or numbers. What are you doing?
Yeah, especially the letters, But when you dive in and try to become that apprentice, you kind of start with understanding terminology, how things work. How does CloudTrail work? What are the difference between organizational trails and account trails, like we were going down? And then jumping into, hey, how do I create a trail? How do I create something that works out so that it is secure from the start? Right? We were speaking about log file integrity. How do I enable that within my logs? I think that's an important piece of the puzzle, especially when you're first starting out, because there are so many pieces of the puzzle that you have to consider. And if you say, hey, give me everything, well, you can get everything, but is it most cost optimized to your needs and your environment? I think that's a good question, because eventually you want to become kind of that sidekick in your environment where you're providing a lot of strategy, so that eventually you can take over said environment, right? So how do you do this? How do you think about this within your overarching piece of the puzzle? Well, I think it's understanding where all those logs going. And if we take that pause, we can kind of figure out, what is the log archive account? It's part of my larger, let's say, security reference architecture design, but it's also a starting place. Because if you were to look at, the simple picture breakdown of this is, all right, you have centralized logs, CloudTrail, access, DNS, flow logs, go into the centralized bucket, and then what do? Do you put in a security lake? Do you sort through those logs? Does it go to your SIM? Do you optimize it before it goes to your SIM to help cut down on costs? These are all pieces of the puzzle that you start to think about as that strategist. Because if you don't think about it, you grab everything or you don't grab enough, then you get to the point of, okay, did I do enough? Right? And I think that's part of the incident response kind of, or I should say threat modeling. It's like, what can we have done better? Right?
Yeah.
Where were you going with that, Russ?
I was going to say a little bit of both. Your after action or your lessons learned is also going to be extremely valuable for this.
Yeah. And I think understanding those pieces is how eventually you get to be a pro. And the funny thing about being a pro is one of the pieces that you have to understand is how do I delve in on a daily basis to understanding those architectural patterns that Russ was speaking about. And best way, go to the blogs. Don't start from scratch. Read about what is happening in different environments. That's how you become a pro. Learning from others, especially when it comes to logging. And let's say, oh, secure AI agent access patterns to AWS resources using MCPs. I wonder what we were speaking about earlier that can correlate to this exact blog. It's almost like we planned this out. But what we don't plan out is how we end the episode. Yeah, and all the tangents. See?
Exactly.
And Russ, I'll let you go first. What did you learn today in today's episode that you want either the people to kind of think about and take that pause or not take that pause?
Yeah, I think where I would go to take that pause would be within, I'm going to say it every single week, the defense in depth, because it's just so important. We're taking very similar concepts to basically all of cybersecurity and then just applying them to specific topics. So if we're going to isolate account, it's very similar to quarantining account, but with some, built-in ability to actually access it. But all of the same principles, IAM, KMS, they're still important, just in a different way.
Yes. And I think that's a great point. And part of where my mind goes is to understanding, hey, all logs have a purpose. They serve a purpose in your environment. And if you're missing one, you don't want to end up with when something happens within your environment. And of course, I always like to get Russ with something at the end of the episode. So,
where did you even get that?
I just pulled it out, right? So
you went to Spencer's this weekend, didn't you?
Yeah. So that's something that you don't want to happen when you're searching for logs, right? Is do you have VPC flow logs? And then you get a buzzer, right? So if I were to take away something, if you were to take away something, it's building everything piece by piece, brick by brick, one XP point at a time to eventually level up yourself as well as your own security posture. But Russ, what is the one thing that you would say?
Well, as always, I'm going to say create an incident response plan.
Yes.
You need not just an incident response plan for you, but also for your automation.
Yes, because if you don't have one, you get the buzzer, right? And on that happy note, I would say have a great day, happy Monday, and look into centralized logging because you can go beyond plus logging all the time. Till next time, till next week, till we see you again. Take care. Bye.